Hi everyone, happy Friday. I'm going to start out this week's podcast by discussing the major findings in a new paper released on Monday. In it, researchers in the US and Canada published the second study ever using whole genome sequencing to study risk genes in autism. In whole genome sequencing, the entire genome, rather than just parts of the genome, are sequenced for analysis. It's a massive undertaking and only possible just recently with advances in technology and a reduction in prices. In this study, they more than doubled their sample size to 85 families with at least 2 children affected with autism. This time, they were also able to include some comparison of behavioral symptoms. I've read various media reports on the study, and I don't think it was meant to be any more than a start into using whole genome sequencing to study the multiple genetic and environmental factors involved in autism. Someone mentioned autism's surprising diversity, quote unquote. To me, there's nothing here that's surprising about the diversity of autism. So first, in the 85 sibling pairs, only 36 showed what are called ASD-relevant mutations. That's 42%, which is similar to findings in intellectual disability. So using this whole genome sequencing, researchers found a genetic risk factor for autism 42% of the time. This alone is pretty big. But what about the other 58%? Well, they may have genes that haven't been associated with autism just yet, or they are genes that are controlled epigenetically, or there are environmental factors involved, or the diagnosis is a result of many genetic mutations acting only in combinations or multiple environmental factors. If this 42% finding is replicated, I'll start calling this other group the other 58%. Another interesting finding is that of that 36 families that showed ASD-relevant mutations, just a little over a third of them showed the same mutation in both siblings affected with autism. This is partially because of the high sporadic or de novo mutation rate. These are mutations that aren't seen in either parent. So the million-dollar question here is, if both siblings were diagnosed with autism, why didn't they show the same mutations? Well, first, as I just mentioned, there are many mutations that are de novo or new. But the better answer is that the symptoms are not the same in each of these people. When the researchers looked at the behavioral symptoms, they were very similar in the pairs that had the same mutation. But when there were different mutations, there were also differences in behavioral symptoms like communication and social behavior. Also, there was a slightly but barely significant difference in IQ between siblings with different genes but the same diagnosis. I've heard news titles saying, it's autisms rather than autism. Yeah, we know, scientists have actually been saying that for quite a while now. More importantly here is that despite the concordance in genes between siblings with ASD using whole genome sequencing, is the fact that siblings are at a higher risk for being diagnosed with autism. Nothing presented in this paper, no genetic analysis presented to date should supersede the fact that children who have an older sibling affected with autism should receive careful examination from infancy from parents and clinicians, and they should pay close attention to developmental milestones. While not all of them may have shared the same genetic mutation, some of them did, and clearly we haven't identified all the genes with ASD to begin with. But thinking about that other 58%, we should do more to think about multiple, not single risk factors. Speaking of environmental factors, yet another study out of Denmark looked at a type of chemical called perfluoroalkyl substances and looked at the risk of autism. The most well-known of these perfluoroalkyl substances is called PFAS, and this has been detected in industrial waste, stain-resistant carpets, carpet cleaning liquids, house dust, water, food, and cookware like Teflon. The examination did not show an association between maternal exposure to these substances during pregnancy and autism. But that's not why I'm reporting it, even though I do think it's important to tell you about the findings and the lack of findings. I'm telling you about it because of all 990 samples tested, there was a measurable amount of these chemicals found in the mothers during their pregnancy. So in order to find an effect, it wouldn't be the presence of the chemical, yes or no, it would be the amount of the chemical. No association was found with autism, but don't breathe a sigh of relief just yet. In animal models, these compounds are neurotoxic and carcinogenic, and if you think this is just going on in Denmark, you're wrong. 98% of people, including pregnant women in the US, have levels in them in their blood as well. So it's clear that just because it isn't associated with autism doesn't mean this class of chemicals is safe. Finally, last week we talked about the overlap in genetic risk factors for autism and ADHD. This past week, a study revealed some of the differences and similarities between boys with either ADHD or autism, or with both ADHD and autism. They managed to find some pretty pure groups, that is, those with just ADHD or just autism, or autism with ADHD. As you might expect, all three groups had the same overall IQ. Boys with autism showed more social communication deficits than those with ADHD, but those with ADHD showed higher levels of inattention and hyperactivity compared to those with autism. It's not really a big surprise. However, when the researchers looked at adaptive skills, they saw some very interesting differences. Adaptive functioning refers to behaviors critical in everyday life, in terms of communication, socialization, self-help, and life skills. They're commonly assessed using what's called the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales. Adaptive behaviors are everyday living skills such as walking, talking, getting dressed, going to school, preparing a meal, cleaning the house. So things like communication and socialization are needed for these skills, but not in the same way as just talking and listening. These are skills that a person learns in the process of adapting to his or her surroundings. So, analyses revealed that the lowest scores were found in the group with autism and ADHD, and they were significantly lower than those with either ADHD alone or autism alone. The findings suggest that children with autism who meet diagnostic criteria for ADHD have poor adaptive functioning. What does this all mean? Overall, the findings suggest it's possible that ADHD may cause adaptive functioning to be worse in people with autism. Therefore, if you can reduce clinically significant ADHD symptoms in children that have autism too, it may lead to better improvements in adaptive functioning. In fact, interventions that target only autism symptoms may not be sufficient to improve adaptive skills in people with both autism and ADHD. Before I end today's podcast, I just want to give a quick shout out to someone without whom these podcasts would not be possible. That person is Meredith Gilmer. She's the Community Relations Manager at the Autism Science Foundation and has been incredibly important to getting these podcasts up and running every week. We are really going to miss you, Meredith, but wish you all the best. Okay, everybody, talk to you next week. Bye-bye.